All right, so that last video was about simplifying. Once we simplify, the next step in doing the math stuff is we're going to solve, right? When you're solving, you're going to still use PEMDAS, but you sort of basically use PEMDAS, but in reverse. So we'll do the add subtract first, then the multiply divide, then exponents and parentheses. You kind of get messed up when you get to this end because we really have to take care of the parentheses first regardless, but you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. Your goal when you're solving is to isolate the variable you're trying to solve for. You want to get it by itself, and if you get it by itself, you've then figured out what number that variable represents on one side of the equation. A couple of rules that you got to remember from Algebra 1 when you're solving equations. Rule number 1, to get rid of a term, quote unquote, to get rid of something, you do the opposite operation, right? So add is the opposite of subtract is the opposite of add, multiply is the opposite of divide, and vice versa. And the other opposite that a lot of people forget is squaring and square rooting, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute as well. Second rule, whatever you do to one side of the equation, even if you make a mistake, this will save you. Whatever you do on one side of the equation, you have to do the identical thing on the other side of the equation, right? So if I multiply by 2 on one side, I have to multiply by 2 on the other side. If I divide by 5 on one side, I have to divide by 5 on the other side. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So let's talk about this. So when I talk about solving and doing PEMDAS in reverse, it's not like that's a hard and fast rule. It just makes your life a lot easier. So let's say we have this equation and I'm now going to substitute just random numbers in here, right? Don't do that when you have a problem. Make sure you substitute in the correct numbers that you're given in the problem. But let's just imagine that we were given these. All right. And so if we look at this equation, we know that our first step is to simplify, but this is actually as simple as this equation can get, right? It can't really get any simpler than this. So now we have to start doing algebra. Remember, we're going to do PEMDAS in reverse, right? We're going to go this way. So we're going to do our add and subtract first, which means I'm going to subtract this 2. I want to get rid of this 2. I know to subtract it because it's added. And some people have trouble figuring out what it is because they're like, well, there's no operation here. Well, if you just flip these two, it would be 1.5t plus 2, and the plus would be in front of the 2, so they're definitely added. We're going to do the opposite operation here to get rid of it. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. Minus 2 on both sides. It gets rid of it here. 10 minus 2 is 8, right? So I've basically moved this 2, quote unquote, moved the 2 to the other side. This didn't change, so I'm going to bring it down. Make sure you have good algebra mechanics. Keep your equal sign in the middle. Separate your left side from the right side of the equation. Bring down to the next line whatever didn't change. All right. So we took care of our add subtract. Now we're to our multiply and divide step. Remember, I'm trying to isolate this t and get it by itself, which means I want to get rid of everything else beside it. I got to get rid of this 1.5. The 1.5 is multiplied by the t. I know that because they're next to each other. The opposite operation, opposite of multiply, is divide. So I'm going to divide by that number. And I'm going to do the same thing on both sides. I'm going to divide by 1.5 because that helps me to get rid of it. 1.5 divided by 1.5 is 1, and I want 1t on this side. That's what I want. And then 8 divided by 1.5 is the calculation I do over here. Turns out if I do that, I get about 5.33, all right? That's how you do that. That's the best way to do algebra, is to sort of basically do PEMDAS in reverse. All right, so we've talked about some rules for algebra. Let's now talk about a few special situations that really commonly trip kids up. First one is, here we go. First one is having to solve for a variable in the denominator. I put this as number 1 because this is the number 1 most commonly made mistake in this class. If we have a fraction equal to a fraction, a lot of kids have a really tough time figuring out how to solve for a variable in the denominator. Basically, you got to get that variable out of the denominator. And the way to get it out of the denominator is to multiply by that variable on both sides. Let's look at that. I showed you this equation before, v equals d over t. We're going to talk about this equation soon. This is basically a fraction equal to a fraction. And anytime you have a fraction equal to a fraction, you can do this. And people say, well, Mr. Vols, the left side is not a fraction. Well, it is, because there's an understood 1 under here. It's a fraction equal to a fraction. And let's go ahead and substitute some numbers. Let's say that we know V. V is 10. And let's say that we know D, which is 40. We're going to substitute 40 in for D. And I want to solve for T. Again, when the variable I'm solving for is in the denominator. People have a lot of problems with this, right? People want to multiply by 40 here. People want to divide by 40 here. Those are the two most common things I get. Do not do that. Remember, I said in the previous slide, multiply by that variable on both sides first, because I want to get it out of here. I don't want it here. So I'm going to multiply by t on both sides. Doing it on this side cancels it out, so to speak, because I have 1 on the bottom, 1 on the top. Remember, there's an understood 1 under here. Top and bottom, they cancel. I've effectively moved this t from this denominator up to the numerator over here, and I get a brand new simplified equation, 10t equals 40, and now I can solve that equation by dividing by 10. T equals 4. 40 divided by 10 is 4. Now, this is only if the variable you're solving for is in the denominator. Let's say we're not solving for t on this, okay? Let's say that we had this equation. Let's say we know V in this case. Let's say V is 40. We're trying to solve for D, and time is 5. Let's just say that, right? In this case, you actually do the same thing. It's the same operation. You're trying to solve for this D. You want to isolate it, so you got to get rid of this 5. Well, how do I get rid of the 5? Well, it's D divided by 5, so I'm going to do the opposite operation, which is multiply. So instead of dividing by 5, I'm going to multiply by 5 on both sides. Gets rid of it over here. 5 times 40 is 120. Is that right? Something like that, right? So it's the same thing. It's just that when I'm multiplying by a variable, I don't get a number, right? So this right here is so important to remember. When the variable you're solving for is in the denominator, multiply by that variable first on both sides to get it out of the denominator, and then that's going to give you a much nicer equation to be able to work with. Next special situation we're dealing with after solving for a variable in the denominator, we're going to solve for a variable that gets squared in the equation. If that's the case, if the variable you're solving for is squared in the equation, every single time that happens, the last step will be to take the square root. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's say we have this equation, vf squared equals vi squared plus 2ad. I've substituted the numbers that I know. I know that VI is 0, A is 9.8, and D is 45. And in this case, I'm solving for VF, which is squared in the equation. Really important that when we do this, we remember that the last step will be to take the square root. So when we first of all simplify this, I know that the 0 squared is 0. That can go away because that's not going to change anything. I'm going to multiply all these three together, and I get 882 on that right side. I'm going to bring down the VF squared. Now, a lot of people right here will put down 882 as their answer, and they'll say, I'm done. No, you're not. We're solving for VF, not VF squared. I have to get rid of this squared as well. And remember, the way to get rid of things is to do the opposite operation. Opposite of squared is to take the square root, and whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. The square root of VF squared is VF, which is what we want, and the square root of 882 happens to be about 29.7 is what it is, and that would be our answer there. All right, so if the variable you're solving for is squared in the equation, the last step would be to take the square root. The last special situation I want to talk about in this video is dealing with halves. A lot of people get confused about this, get a lot of mistakes. Basically, here's the deal. Multiplying by 1/2 is the same thing as dividing by 2. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So if you see an equation that multiplies by 1/2, just divide by 2. It's fewer keystrokes. It's easier. And the vice versa is true. Dividing by 1/2 is the same thing as multiplying by 2. So if we need to divide by 1/2, if that's what you need to do, just multiply by 2. Fewer keystrokes. It's much easier to. All right, so that's pretty much it with dealing with special situations. I'm going to stop this video here, and we'll do some practice problems in the next video.